Okay. Yeah. So sorry for that initial delay. So this lecture will be on scaling up and big data, which for many of you might seem quite counterintuitive that this lecture should come at the very end when the name of the course is Quantitative Big Imaging. But we will cover why that makes sense and sort of how this fits with everything else that we've done in the next slide. So next week will be a guest lecture, which will cover some of the scaling up ideas and how this is actually used or was used at Roche to do high content screening, and how it's used at the Nexus Center for handling a lot of their bigger problems. And the week after, we'll have some applications of this for aerial imaging from a postdoc from ScopeM, who was doing his PhD on analyzing aerial images at sort of scale. And so, of course, there's lots of useful references for all of the topics that we're covering here. This doesn't really have much time to go into the detail of every single thing that we cover. The main thing is to understand the point of what's being done and how you can easily get started. Just for an idea from you, is there more interest for cluster computing or GPU computing? Cluster? GPU? Anyone? One GPU person? Okay. So it's what? So using GPUs. So if you wanted deep learning, would be GPU rather than cluster. So has anyone used Hadoop before? Or Spark? TensorFlow? Has everyone heard of TensorFlow and Spark? Okay, so some response there. Okay, so we'll cover a little bit of that. I mean, so the exercises cover how you can use actually the Condor, sort of high throughput computing engine at ETH to run some of your sort of distributed jobs. There's also some information on using Sun Grid Engine, Oracle Grid Engine, which is on some of the other clusters. And of course, a lot of this will be very specific to the setup that you're trying to use. And so if you're using Euler, that will look different than if you're using Merlin or if you're using CSCS, and you'll have to know how to adapt whatever you're doing to that. But we'll cover sort of the basic ideas of those things. These top lectures are quite useful for understanding the point. So why was this technology developed in the first place, and how does it actually look at scale? And then finally, some brief things kind of on databases and sort of when these are important and how these can integrate with sort of standard workflows that you look at. And then finally, kind of cloud computing. And so when this makes sense and how you can take advantage of cloud computing once you've sort of done the big data cluster computing aspects, how that all fits together. So in terms of the outline, we'll sort of start off with some motivation and then briefly sort of computer science principles. So probably most of you are familiar with ideas of like parallel computing, but what does it actually mean? And why is it different from sort of standard computing? And then we'll move sort of beyond that into the idea of what is sort of distributed computing and how can we handle sort of larger tasks well. So kind of what's the motivation? And so there's a number of different things that come into play. So one of the first ones is sort of really big data sets. So we're actually working on this week with the Human Brain Project, and so they have data sets where each slice in their image is around 25 gigabytes, and they have over 1,000 slices. And so to even open this on a normal computer would crash it, one slice, let alone all of the slices, and then to be able to kind of actually do something useful. If you want to find neurons, segment them, identify where different neurons are, start to look at connections between them, you very quickly run out of memory. You can, of course, look at a really downsampled version of the image, but that's then not really what you're interested in looking at. It's difficult to find computers with more than 256 gigabytes of memory. To load that whole data set would be sort of in the terabyte range. Drive speed. If you crash, you lose everything, which means, if you're loading lots of things on different machines, you need to have something that's sort of reliable. And you end up running sort of a bunch of manual checkpoint code, and I'll talk about that. The other task is sort of many data sets. And so if you're coming from sort of the genome scale projects or high throughput imaging or high content screening, you'll often deal with thousands of data sets that need to be analyzed identically. And so this covers sort of a lot of different problems where your data sets themselves aren't very big, but you want to do exactly the same analysis with all of them, and you don't want to wait for them to kind of all run serially. This is also applicable for sort of what we covered a little bit with the last lecture and sort of dynamic experiments, where you have then sort of a sequence of images which can have, is really only one sample, but you are looking at maybe 1,000 different time steps. And so you want to analyze all of them the same way so that you can make connections between what's going on. And then, if you look at sort of hospital or radiology, they make 1 petabyte of new scans every year. And so these are all very small. None of their scans are larger than maybe a few hundred megabytes. But because there's so many scans being done, it becomes quite difficult. The next area where this really comes in is kind of this exploratory studies. And so when you have these huge data sets, trying to analyze them, test hypotheses, look at making new analyses, can be very, very, very time consuming. Even filtering or trying out 2 different filters on your data set can be really problematic. And so how can you scale up this analysis well? So in terms of example projects, so one of the interesting projects we've worked on is sort of this zebra full animal phenotyping. And this is where you have sort of 11,500 by 2,800 by 628. So quite anisotropic, and this is what sort of the images look like. And you basically have cellular scale resolution for an entire adult animal. And so this is quite an interesting problem because you have really all the information you could ever want about this. You have each cell kind of labeled, and you need to start sort of extracting where are all these cells, where are the different types of cells, how are they maybe connected together, and how can this be used to kind of understand the growth and development of this animal better. The Human Brain Project sort of is on a similar scale where you have thousands of gigavoxels per sample. So analyzing this data becomes quite limiting if you are stuck with a single computer or a single core. So how can you make this analysis faster? And kind of what's wrong with the usual approaches. And so for those of you who use MATLAB or Python, you have kind of this standard workflow. This one happens to be MATLAB, but it looks very similar for Python. And so you kind of read an image, you do some sort of filter, maybe you label the different components, you make a histogram, and then you save out the text file. And that this works well for one sample, where you have your test image and you want to have this histogram with a component label output. But if you want to start doing different things, this is quite tedious. So that we now have kind of hard-coded what file we're reading, what function we're performing, what settings we're using for that function, what our threshold is. And that means we have to go back and kind of manually change it if we want to compare Gaussian to median. And then we have to remember to save it as something different. We can't save it as out.txt, we have out_median. And then maybe we want to try different filters, different thresholds, and we very quickly end up with a very complicated script that's very tedious to sort of run. If you want to run the same analysis on an entire folder of images, we now need to kind of rewrite this so that it does everything in a loop. And this can also be very time consuming and slow. And so basically you have to rewrite everything every time you come up with a new idea. And you end up with the problem of you sort of have results that are completely decoupled from the analysis. And so if you're not incredibly organized with what analysis you're running and what results you're saving, you can end up with a sort of disaster of different results, and some of them look really good and some of them look really bad, but you actually don't know what you did to each image in order to get that result. And so this is sort of the worst case scenario, because as a scientist, as we talked about in the last lectures, this reproducibility is of utmost importance. And so if you can't say exactly how you got a result, it doesn't matter how good it is, it's useless, because someone else needs to be able to reproduce your result. Someone else performing exactly the same steps should get a very similar result. And so for the computer science principles, we won't go into too much detail on these ideas, but it's important to have some understanding of why these problems are so complicated and what you need to be aware of. So we'll cover kind of briefly sort of parallelism. It's where you can divide tasks into separate pieces which can be worked on at the same time. And so for some things, this is, very, very easy. But for other things, this is very difficult. And so if you look at a task like, doing a summation, if you want to add up all the pixels in your image together, this is fairly easy to parallelize. So you basically, have each thread or each core of your CPU take a different piece of the image, sum up the pixels in that piece, and then you take all those sums and combine them together. But if you have tasks that are more complicated, where you need to know what's happening in other parts of the image, it becomes very difficult to parallelize this. So if you're looking at something like component labeling, this requires sort of knowing what all the components are, knowing if this pixel is neighboring any of the other connected components, and so there's not really a clear place you could divide this task up to have it run efficiently on multiple cores. And so these are, kind of very simple example tasks, but the idea you want to understand from this is that it's not trivial for a lot of different problems. Of course, for the problems where you have 1,000 images that look exactly the same, the parallelization is easy. You just run each image independently. But where you have one giant image and you're trying to analyze how things are connected together, that becomes a more difficult problem to slice up, because you can't necessarily treat each image as if it had nothing to do with all the other images. Distributed computing kind of takes parallelism one step further. And this is where you now don't have everything in sort of the same machine, the same process. It's where you have everything running on different machines and different processes. And you now have to be responsible for the communication between all these different boxes, and what happens when sort of problems or in the communication between them, and how they work well. And so these are problems where your main task with the distributed computing isn't really the image processing, it's the communication between all the boxes and the coordination. And so you become much more of a manager than a image processing scientist. And so this is, sort of one of the principal reasons why this comes at the very, very end, because if you don't know what you want to do, if you don't know which operations you're trying to perform, then distributed and parallel computing are a complete waste of your time. Deep learning as well. You have to have a very clear, defined task before any of these things make sense. If you parallelize the wrong algorithm, it might be a very fast implementation and it might work really well on 300 cores or on some supercomputer, but it's ultimately the wrong algorithm and it doesn't help you at all. You need to be very confident that what you're making is the right approach and gives you meaningful results, because if it doesn't really give you meaningful results, doing it on a huge data set doesn't make any sense at all. And so if we look at kind of distributed computing in more detail, sort of, if you have 10 friends who collectively know all the capital cities in the world, you have 10 machines and you have this information that's distributed across these different machines, how can you go about solving that problem in a parallel way? I mean, so the serial way for that would be to have all your friends give you the list of capital cities they know. You then make one giant list of capital cities, and if someone asks the capital city, you just check it to this list. How would a parallel implementation of this look? Any ideas? So the parallel implementation of this would basically be that you yell out, I want to know the capital of this city, and the person who knows that capital would respond. And this means that you don't have to collect one list on one computer. You can have this information distributed and access it distributed in a very quick way. If you sort of have, who has the most countries, you can just have each person yell out how many countries they know, and then you take all of this information serially and decide what to do with it. If you want to know how much money all of you have in your wallets collectively, each person can measure independently how much money is in their wallet, and then you can add it together. So they all sort of tell you how much money is in their wallet. But if you want to know the median coin, for example, that each person has in their pocket, so everyone has 100 coins in their pocket, and they range from a penny to a 5 franc coin or whatever, you have a very difficult task because the median, can anyone think of how you would do this? Or why this is a difficult task? Yeah. So this is actually a modified Google interview question of you have 1 million numbers on 1 million computers. How do you find the median of that list? And so, of course, sort of the approach initially would be to collect all of the numbers on one machine and then find the one that's in the middle, because you have to sort them and then look at the one in the middle in order to have the median. Can you think of any way you could parallelize this problem? So if you got asked this at an interview, would you just say, I have no idea? I don't really want to work for Google anyways? Okay. Well, I can let you think about it longer and see if you come up with any interesting answers. It's an interesting problem because it forces you to think about a lot of these different tasks of you have 1 million different, 1 million computers and all of them have 1 million numbers on it. Or maybe it's 10,000 and 10,000. But anyways, the problem is, you can't bring all the numbers onto one computer because this would be way too much communication and time. And you have all these computers that are now sitting idly. How can you solve a problem like that with a parallel or distributed approach? And as you can see, that's very different than trying to solve an image analysis problem. Your focus becomes now here much more on performance and minimizing communication and making everything run efficiently and making sure you handle sort of the edge cases well, not about how do you get the best result. One of the other things that comes up with cluster computing especially, and distributed and parallelism as well a bit, is this idea of resource contention. And so you have sort of fixed amounts of resources, and if you're working on a job in parallel, you want to do things at the same time. If you are building a sandcastle with a friend, you have resource contention over the sandcastle because you're both trying to build something and you're both trying to look at the same thing at the same time. And so with humans, we're quite clever. We're able to kind of say, I want to work on this now, you should work on this other part. But computers are really stupid, exceptionally stupid. So when you're writing code, you need to explicitly say how it needs to work together with other cores or other machines. Otherwise, it won't do that. And so one of the standard problems here is sort of the dining philosophers problem, where you have 6 philosophers at a table, and you have 6 forks. Everyone needs 2 forks to eat. And so each philosopher takes the fork on his left, holds it in his hand, and then none of them can start eating. And none of them put the fork down because none of them are able to eat or finish eating at all. And so this is sort of called a deadlock. And this happens very, very frequently when you're writing parallel code, because you have all sorts of things that require multiple different resources at the same time. And if they can't get all of those resources, they can't start what they're doing, and so they will kind of wait indefinitely to get that. And you often have 2 or 3 things that are waiting for the exact same resource, and so nothing starts running at all. And so these kinds of problems are, in general, very difficult to come up with solutions for, and are very problematic, because instead of having, one task running, you now have 0 tasks running because everything's waiting for this to work. And so you have something that actually runs much slower because you're trying to do it in parallel than if you just said one philosopher, grab 2 forks, start eating, then drop the 2 forks, and then the next philosopher goes in. I mean, there the serial approach works perfectly, and the parallel approach doesn't work at all. Once you have sort of these parallel problems set up, you sort of end up with all of these different challenges that you run into. And so you have this idea of coordination, so that when you have multiple things running at the same time, you need to make sure that the coordination there works. And this is quite time-consuming and difficult. You have this idea of mutability, which then sort of directly feeds in to reproducibility. And so if you think about, if you're running a big Gaussian filter on your image, and you have 25 different cores running at the same time, and they're each running on part of the image, what happens if one of the cores changes part of the image after the other core has already written to it, or after the other core has read it? And so you end up with this mismatch, this sort of inconsistency between the images, or what you think you have and what you have, depending on what order things happen in. And so this can be very problematic. Particularly if you're, a bank, and someone goes to take out, $1,000, and they took out $1,000 yesterday, but you haven't registered that in the system yet, and now they take out $1,000 twice, and you end up with the wrong amount in their bank account. And so this is a very critical problem to be aware of and to be thinking about solving. And then blocking, which is sort of what we talked about in the last slide, and sort of how can you make sure these problems are avoided without sort of completely negating the problems of distributed computing. So obviously, if you have this mutability issue, where you say basically everything's blocked when you're trying to write it and nothing else can make a change to it while you're writing it, you solve the problem of mutability, but you now prevent anything from happening in parallel. And so this will slow you down significantly. And so you need an approach that's able to keep these mutability problems and coordination problems solved without blocking or slowing everything down too much. Distribution is, of course, everything you have with parallel, and then more, because now you actually have to kind of send instructions to another machine. So you don't just have to have the data there, you have to have what it's supposed to do with the data. When you're running on one CPU, you have exactly the same environment, exactly the same variables, everything is fine. When you're running on multiple machines, these are all completely independent, and so you're responsible for telling the other machine exactly what it's supposed to be doing. You have sort of the problem with fault tolerance, that if you have 1,000 computers working on a problem, and one of them fails for whatever reason, you don't want your whole job to crash. And if you look at a large company like Google, I think they have a computer failing every minute or something like that, maybe even more frequently now. And so if you're trying to solve large problems, you have to be aware that your machines will crash. And how can you make sure your entire website doesn't go down, or you don't have to restart from the very beginning because one machine happened to crash. You then have the problem of kind of how can you access and process data from many different computers quickly without sort of having access to the same data at the same time. Having hard drives on computers is very easy. Having a very fast shared network storage becomes very difficult. So one of the important things to look at, sort of the starting point for this, is sort of imperative programming. And so this is the programming most of you are very familiar with. And this is sort of languages like C, C++, Java, MATLAB. And this is where you really give exact orders. And so you say, this is exactly what needs to happen, and this is the order that it needs to happen in. And so you kind of have this very implicit time ordering. And your data management is manually controlled. And so if we have this example function at the beginning where you had sort of imread, BW label, export save file, you manually control all of that. And the whole idea of job and task scheduling is also completely manual. So you say exactly what each core is supposed to be doing and how it works. This means, as sort of the upside, is that you have a lot of potential to tweak and optimize performance because you're directly controlling everything. And so if we look at a very simple example of kind of making a soup, if I made this list of instructions for making a soup, this would be kind of the imperative approach. And so you would say first buy vegetables at the market, then buy meat at the butcher, then chop carrots into pieces, then chop potato into pieces. You kind of have this list of things that have to be done in exactly this order. And even though you could have one person buying meat at the butcher and one person chopping carrots into pieces, it's not clear from this list that those two tasks can be done independently. Because you can't have people, adding chopped vegetables to the soup before the vegetables are chopped. So there are some dependencies in there, but because there's no way of expressing that sort of task 6 needs to wait for task 4, 3, and 4, you have the problem that you have to perform this list exactly in the order that it's given. Otherwise, you might end up with an unexpected result. Declarative programming is sort of the other end of the spectrum. And so there's very few languages which are only declarative, but they're possible with sort of languages like, SQL is only declarative. Erlang, Haskell, Scala, Python, and R have declarative parts to them. And this is where you kind of state goals rather than specific details. And so this is where you don't implicitly say how data is managed and copied or what happens exactly in what order. You specify what things need to be done. And so here you say basically, buy vegetables at market is some sort of task, and the result for this task goes into shop veggies. Buy meat for butcher, this goes into shop meat. Wait for chopped veggies and then chop carrots into pieces, goes into chopped carrots. And so you sort of specify a hierarchy for what tasks need to get done. And this is then the very declarative approach because you don't actually say what needs to be done first, second, third, or fourth. You can start running all of these things at the same time. And this one will wait for the first task to be done before it gets started because you've implicitly specified that relationship. And so this is the kind of other extreme for having something that's very, very declarative so that you can run it in parallel easily. And so if we kind of look at the comparison, they look similar. From an instruction perspective, it's more or less the same. We added this weight, maybe. There's some ideas of chopped carrots and chopped potatoes as variables. But it doesn't look that much different than what we had before. But in fact, it's a lot different because we've now expressed the sort of dependencies inside of our structure rather than having this assumed time dependency from the top to the end. And so if you want to make an imperative soup faster, how would you do it? How can you parallelize this imperative soup process? Nothing? Yeah. Well, see, the problem is the imperative soup, we haven't actually specified what things can be done together and what things depend on something else. So with the imperative soup, if you think about it from the sort of computer's perspective, or the very, very simple person that you give this list to process, they don't know from the list that you gave them that those things can be done together. So if you want to do this in parallel, the only way to parallelize this task is to make 10 copies of this list and have 10 different people make soup at the same time. This would be the kind of only way to parallelize this, because you don't know what those dependencies are, and the person given the list can't really be expected to reason about what those dependencies could be because you haven't specified them. You know, when you write this code here in MATLAB, it's for you very obvious that sort of you need to have done the CL count before you write that out to a text file. MATLAB doesn't know that. MATLAB isn't able to look at this and say, this is the sensible time course for the things that you're trying to do. All MATLAB knows is that you've given it 5 instructions, and it will execute those 5 instructions in exactly the order you gave it. It does absolutely no thinking about what would be a better way to optimize these instructions, which ones could you run together, which ones could you run separately, because that's not its job. Its job is to do exactly what you tell it to do and run them. Whereas with sort of this declarative soup, you don't say exactly what needs to happen in what order. You simply specify kind of tasks that need to be done and what the dependencies between these tasks are. And so this is a very different way of thinking about the problem. And this can actually be sort of connected to maybe like an Excel spreadsheet. So when you're writing code in Excel, you know, you have different fields which are dependent on other fields. You know, you write column B equals A, column A plus 1. And you don't actually have to say manually every time A is updated, go and update B. It's implicitly linked together. And Excel or Google Docs or OpenOffice is responsible for managing that computation of when you update a value, it then automatically updates the columns and updates whatever graphs are based on this. And you simply work in this very declarative way of specifying relationships between things. And so kind of the problem with the imperative soup is we've specified it all very clearly, but you have no way of really parallelizing it. You can run all the tasks separately, but that won't make your soup any quicker. That means you just have much more soup at the end. And so with the declarative soup, you can make it quicker by simply sort of like you said before, combining the buying steps. And actually what we can do is we can just start all of these different tasks on different threads and let them run. And that, you'll see these 2 tasks won't start doing anything until this task finishes, but these will then sort of wait for that task to finish. And so that you can end up with your soup much quicker because you can run all of these things in parallel. You don't have to run them all on one thread on one machine. And so kind of the results is that, with an imperative approach, you can optimize specific tasks. So chopping, mixing vegetables or whatever can be really, really high performance so that they happen very quickly. And so if we look at MATLAB or Python or a lot of the routines in KNIME, for example, you have this, so that the individual operations have been very optimized for that operation itself. So when you tell MATLAB to do a fast Fourier transform, it will use all of the cores on your machine to do that fast Fourier transform. But when you then feed the output of that to something else, that then only happens on one core because it doesn't know exactly what it's doing, and so there's not any ability for it to understand what's going on. Declarative kind of approach is, run everything at once. Each core or computer takes the tasks and runs it, and the execution order doesn't matter because you've specified the dependencies inside. And then this is sort of, you wait for things to be available. And so you have a lot of tasks that are potentially waiting, but this is a relatively low cost. This is also sort of compatible with the idea of lazy evaluation. And that's where, sort of the list item itself doesn't actually do anything. It just sort of creates this dependency. And that means if you had sort of a step here to buy tomatoes as a, shop tomatoes, it would never actually be performed because you don't actually need it at the end. And of course, in the imperative approach, if one of your steps is buy tomatoes, even if you never use tomatoes again, your tool doesn't know that that's a step that's not necessary, and so it will run it no matter what. And so kind of one of the challenges for scaling up of experiments is kind of keeping all the results and organized in a reasonable manner. And as we saw with that script before, if you kind of save everything out to text file, this becomes very difficult to keep track of. And if you're using MATLAB and R and then Excel and ImageJ, you end up with a lot of different tools which you have to save output files from in order to make sure that everything's running well together. And this is then very tedious. So to kind of start off with, what are the possibilities once we've sort of addressed that we have a problem and we'd like to use other solutions for them. We kind of have this idea of queue computing. This is how most clusters work. And so what you have here is you have sort of a queue processing system. And so this might be Sun, Grid Engine, Oracle, Apple XGrid, Condor, Slurm. There's at least a dozen other ones that are very popular. And this lets you kind of manage resources, jobs, and users. And so resources is sort of similar to what we talked about before, where you have sort of a fixed number of processors, memory, local storage, access to special bandwidth or special resources like a printer for a given period of time. So basically you have, 1,000 CPUs and a gigabyte or a terabyte of memory, and you now need to sort of specify all of the things that you have. And someone can make a job where they request sort of necessary resources and how long they need the resources for. And then users are people who are making jobs, and you sort of have the problem that you don't want one user to dominate the resources all the time. So how can you share the resources fairly? Because you don't necessarily want each job to get an equal amount of resources, but you want to somehow have the users getting equal access. And some jobs, might be like reconstructing this giant human brain image could take, 1,000 hours, and other jobs could take 10 minutes. And how do you make sure the resources are distributed fairly among all the people who have them and efficiently? And so this is why you have these systems, because they're capable of managing a lot of different resources where people are submitting jobs all the time, and it can then give those resources to a specific job very easily. So we have kind of the structure of a cluster where you have sort of a master node, where this is the node that's responsible for the cluster. This is the central node you communicate with. You then have a worker node, and this is where the computations are actually done. And so for Condor, that's all the machines in this lab. And so when you aren't logged into the machines are part of a Condor cluster, which can be, running tasks on them in the background. And then you have sort of the scheduler. And this is sort of the whole access point and management for the cluster where this decides what tasks are run on which machine at which time. And so the master and the cluster have sort of similar tasks, but the master is really responsible for the communication, while the scheduler is responsible for distribution of all of these resources. To quickly go over the idea of databases, this is an important, have all of you worked with databases before? So does everyone know what SQL is? Has anyone heard of SQL before? Or SQL? And does anyone know what SQL stands for? Nobody. Somebody has to know what it means. SQL? Like MySQL, Oracle? Nothing. Okay. So SQL stands for Structured Query Language, and that's one of these declarative languages that we sort of mentioned before. And this is very important to at least be aware of, because this is how, I would say, most of the world's data is stored and organized. And so you have this idea of a database, which is a collection of tables that have sort of rows and columns in them. So it's a bunch of very small, or a bunch of tables. And so here's kind of a very small, simple example that if you sort of had, animals measured in an experiment and their weight, you have kind of an ID for an animal and a weight. And this might be your animals table. If you now did sort of a cellular analysis on these different animals, you then might have another table called cells, where the first column sort of links it to what animal this cell came from. The second is kind of, is it a cancer or a healthy cell? Third is anisotropy and volume, maybe two things we've calculated before. And this is now how we can structure this result. And so if we look at how the course was run up until now, we made lots of, CSV or text files as our output. But CSV and text files are very difficult for lots of people to work with. And databases allow you to have a very clean, organized structure that many different people can access for different purposes, where the analysis and the connections between all of these are handled well. And so if you have a text file and you have 3 different people trying to read and write to the text file at the same time, you have a major problem. You can't easily coordinate who's writing what, and you could have people writing to the same line at the same time, and it would be a disaster. And when you have a database, you can now have one point that people are communicating with or other resources are communicating with, and you have a very clear, structured list of things they're allowed to say and do, and you can then sort of govern what's going on there. And so that's why these exist in the first place, because you don't just want to have unstructured or table or text data everywhere. You want to have a very well-organized set of data that you're working with. And this is sort of the whole idea about databases. And this is important before we move on to big data, because this is what small data is. So if you're using text files right now, that's not small data. That's tiny data or something else. This is what sort of the state of the art was up until maybe 10 years ago, 15 years ago. And what's the state of the art for a lot of things today? I mean, even at Facebook, they manage their users in a MySQL database, or they did up until recently. And so you can have millions and millions of rows and columns, and you can do searches and analysis on them very easily because it's a robust system that's been developed over sort of generations to perform well. So SQL, and this is probably one of the most important programming languages to know, stands for Structured Query Language, and this is really the quasi-universal language for interacting with databases. And so basically what you have is you have a language that isn't linked to MATLAB or Python or R or one core on one computer. You have a language that's sort of independent of that. And so you are able to make queries, select volume from cells without having to worry, is the table cells on a Hive cluster with 100 terabytes of storage and 5,000 computing nodes, or is it on a local file on your hard drive in a SQLite database? You simply write select volume from cells, and that query runs, and the result you get is that. And so that's quite impressive, because it's now completely abstracted away from how the data is actually stored in the database and what sort of database or interface you have. And this is sort of why this is a declarative language. I guess this example is even better, with select average volume from cells where type equals cancer. And so this, you now specify what you want to do, but you actually don't specify any code that's being run. You don't have any for loop going through each one of the cells and then trying to figure out, is the type cancer, and if the type's cancer, then put it in this variable that we then use to make an average. You just specify what task you want to run. And when you restrict yourself to the limited set of tasks that SQL implements, you now let someone else who spent their entire life optimizing and writing code well implement this as fast as possible. And so when you make this query to a database, the database is able to understand what you're trying to do and find the most efficient parallel distributed algorithm for calculating that result. And so it allows you to be completely abstracted away from, how is that data organized? What sort of loops do you need to make? How do you go through all the data? How can you do it efficiently? And it can just do a very, very quick analysis on this. And so you could do all these things very easily without SQL using Excel, MATLAB, or R. But if I told you you had to make this query run, on 100 billion rows efficiently, you would probably have to write, maybe 100 or 1,000 lines of code to do that. And with SQL, you now just have one statement that you submit, and it figures out how to run that efficiently, how to get the data from the right places, and give you your result. And so this is a very different paradigm for thinking about problems, but it's the way sort of small data works today. And so small data is probably not even the right term, because this is used for huge problems, thousands, millions, billions of different data points that you have in systems. But it has its own limitations, and that's where sort of big data comes in. But until you understand how kind of SQL and small data work, the whole idea of big data is sort of superfluous. That big data exists because this wasn't enough for some really complicated problems. And what's nice with SQL is that you can do very advanced things in it. And so you can have sort of nested queries where you start to have the volume from cells where the animal weight is above 80, and you can kind of combine those two things together. And you now have things running on different tables in your database, but you don't have to do any computation on your end. You just give it that query and you get the results you want. You can also sort of get the weight and average cell volume for all of the animals that you're looking at by sort of joining those tables together. And so SQL gives you the ability to make these very complicated expressions without having sort of any library or dependency or any other specifications behind it. You can also express things like networks using SQL, but this isn't really what it's meant for. And so you sort of have a stretch that if you want to connect these two different nodes together, you sort of have node 2 and node 1. You basically have a table where you represent sort of the ID of the first node and the ID of the second node and the number of junctions. And so you say that, node 1 is connected to node 2 with 800 connections. Node 1 is connected to node 3 with 400. Node 3 is connected to node 1 with 300. And so if you want to calculate how many connections each cell has, you can do that fairly easily. So you can select ID as connection count from cells. You can also sort of look at how many cells are within two connections of each cell. And so this would be, for cells if you're looking at cell networks, or if you're on Facebook and you're trying to figure out how many friends do two people have in common, you would do a query like this. And so it's still fairly readable with some, with kind of two joins in it. But now if you start to solve more generic problems of how many connections do you have between you and Kevin Bacon, for example, this becomes a much more complicated query because you now sort of have to have n number of joins until you've found someone who's connected to Kevin Bacon. And this becomes something that's not very difficult to express in SQL, very easy to express in SQL anymore. And so that's why sort of NoSQL exists, and this is kind of a not only or an extension of SQL, which allows you to have databases that are structured in a different way so that they're better suited to graph-like problems. And so we won't go into that in too much detail, but the idea is that you sort of move away from just having a table structure of data to having a structure of data that allows you to incorporate sort of more of the specific relationships between things.
Actually, much more fitting for use on multiple machines.
Than multiple machines.
And the reason behind NoSQL is to make it usable, like thousands of machines.
Yeah.
You cannot do it with SQL, not easily.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's one of the things. So if we look at like MongoDB, the thing it brings is scalability. So it makes it really easy to just add more machines and get a database that functions much better at really large scale. But there's other ones like Neo4j, which isn't necessarily very good on parallel, on having a lot of different machines, but it's very good at having graphs. And so NoSQL covers a big, wide collection of different things, depending on what your problems are. And so yeah, for having a huge number of things, MongoDB can solve some problems much more efficiently than SQL. Making a SQL database distributed is difficult to do because you have to somehow figure out how you split it up. Do you have every table on every machine? Do you just have some tables on some machines? How do you make sure if you make an update to one table on one machine that the other machines know about it? And that becomes a very challenging coordination problem. But with the graph databases, the problem is more of how can you express a query that you're interested in finding out, like what is the number of connections you need to make to connect cell A and cell B in a more efficient way than just using a SQL query for this. So I think we'll take a break here and then continue sort of on the big data slides.